This book, our Constitution, protects our society and empowers us to govern. The protea leaves are us, the people, who freely elect our voices in Parliament. The drum calls the people of Parliament, through whom we govern together. And the sun is our country, healing our past, improving our lives, and energizing our potential. Together, our Constitution, our people, our Parliament, and our country are building our great South African nation. Parliament TV, Channel 408 on DSTV.
Good afternoon and welcome to Parliament TV. Igama lam ndinguThembi Nkosi Ngoma. Welcome to a special live broadcast commemorating the adoption of the South African Constitution by the Constitutional Assembly 28 years ago on 8 May 1996.
Good afternoon indeed. I am Shihlamari Songobeni. As Thembi Nkosi has mentioned, today marks 28 years since the Constitutional Assembly adopted the Constitution, with 2/3 of the Assembly voting in favor, with 2 nays and 10 abstentions.
The Constitutional Assembly was made up of members of Parliament who were tasked with agreeing upon final constitution within 2 years. This was one of the first tasks of the first democratic parliament. The Constitutional Assembly launched a nationwide public participation program that included civil society, public meetings, and the educational radio programs.
Now, the gravity of the task faced by the Constitutional Assembly cannot be understated, as the Assembly's members had to advance their respective party principles and thresh out compromises with a looming deadline. We will be speaking to some guests today to hear more about the journey of the drafting of the Constitution, as well as its role as the supreme law of the land, and delve into the significance of the Constitution 28 years later, exploring its role in shaping our nation's governance and fostering a culture of inclusivity and accountability. Stay tuned. We'll be right back.
A constitution, important as it is, it's a piece of paper. But it must be a piece of paper that lays the basis for real and genuine democratic transformation, and not write down things which in fact in practice, it might look good on paper, but in practice, they actually block the changing of economic, political, and social relations in our country. Part of the relief for some of the negotiators was that now everything had been referred to the Cyril Roof Channel. And because we said now, in order to tie down these issues, all of them now, they must just be dealt with by the channel. I think during that day, the onus really was on the National Party now. Because I think it had become very clear to them that we cannot move. I think some of them even began to appreciate that, honestly, we cannot expect the ANC to move beyond this and still carry their constituency along. Part of the frustration then arose out of the fact that they would come back, instead of saying yes or no, they would still try and come with new kinds of formulations, and it became a frustration. The part of the jubilation that you were seeing was that we were freed by that time, because we were just waiting for them to say yes or no and then take the consequences of saying no, which was going to be a referendum route, which, as I have said, no one wanted.
Have participated in a project that has opened up for this country a basis for us as a country to really attend to all the problems that had necessitated the struggles that we've waged over the centuries.
Big and major one for us is, of course, the property clause that we will be insisting. We will try our utmost best until the final dying moments to see if we can get, if it must be in the Constitution, that it must be there to provide access to land rather than protection to private property. So we will be making new amendments, submissions tomorrow.
We often forget and lose sight of just how historic and profound some of these events are. When we vote today to adopt the Constitution before us, we will be giving life to a new nation, a nation of free and equal people. Our country, our people, will indeed have come of age when we vote for this Constitution.
Thank you for staying with us on Parliament TV. This is a special live broadcast to commemorate the adoption of the Constitution by the Constitutional Assembly 28 years ago. Joining us now is Prof. Thuli Madonsela. Prof. Madonsela is a professor of law occupying the Law Trust Research Chair in Social Justice at Stellenbosch University. She is also the founder of the Tuma Foundation for Democracy, Leadership and Literacy, and a member of the South African Academy of Sciences. She was recently appointed to the United Nations Scientific Advisory Board and as chairperson of Cities Alliance. The former Public Protector of South Africa and full-time law commissioner, Professor Madonsela was one of the drafters of the South African Constitution and a co-architect and drafter of several constitutionally mandated laws, including the Equality Act, Employment Equity Act, and the Promotion of Administrative Justice Act. Good afternoon, Prof, and thank you for joining us on Parliament TV as we reflect on South Africa's Constitution. Good afternoon.
Hello.
Good afternoon, Prof. I'm just checking if you can hear me. Good afternoon, Prof. Can you hear me now?
I can hear you perfectly now, colleague. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prof, for joining us on Parliament TV. To begin this conversation, Prof, if you could just briefly share your insights into the significance of the South African Constitution, particularly as one of the people that drafted it.
Well, the South African Constitution is one of the greatest achievements of human beings in the modern world. And in South Africa, there are two stages at which there was this achievement. The interim constitution, which turns 30 this year, having been adopted in 1993 and put into operation on April 27, 1994. Then the final constitution, which was adopted in 1996 and terms 28. And as Nelson Mandela said at the adoption of the constitution, there's very few human achievements that compare to that. And the reason it was a huge human achievement is that we came from a history of a wicked state. From the moment the South African state came into being, it created a pyramid-styled society where Black people were intentionally dispossessed and impoverished, then placed at the bottom of the pyramid. And that state from 1910 onwards saw Black people as subhuman beings whose only usefulness was to serve white people who were placed at the top of the pyramid. And that exacerbated the conflict that had already been there since the wars and the first statutory land dispossession that had happened in 1894 through the Glen Grey Act. And then tension was exacerbated, even leading to the 1943, the first Bill of Rights this country ever saw. And of course, the 1943 Bill of Rights by Black intellectuals did not yield freedom. Instead, we got apartheid in 1948. And so the Constitution, at least the 1993 Constitution, came after 46 years of apartheid and 3.5 centuries of colonialism. And so that was a triumph of the human spirit, but also it was an indication that when human beings come together and begin to recognize each other's humanity, the gulfs that separate them can be overcome.
Thank you for that brief background, Prof. So what were some of the most significant decisions or compromises made during the constitutional negotiations, and how did they shape the final outcome of the Constitution?
Sorry, could you repeat the question, sir?
All right, yes, Prof. Prof, if you could briefly share, then having shared that brief historical background, so what were some of the most significant decisions or compromises that were made during the constitutional negotiations, and how did they shape the final outcome of the Constitution?
Thank you. Some of the key decisions that had to be made included the fact that there had to be a Bill of Rights. And it's often lied and said that the Bill of Rights was only a Mr. de Klerk's idea, and therefore it was a reflection of defeat to the liberation movement. I've already indicated that the liberation movement was the first to come up with a Bill of Rights in 1943 already as part of the African claims. And when the negotiations started, the ANC came with its own proposal, which had a Bill of Rights. But there had to be negotiations. We'll see, for example, that the original proposal from the African National Congress did not include socio-economic rights. And of course, those were hard negotiations. Fortunately, a lot of us academics had been working on socio-economic rights and looking at India. And we were able to show that socio-economic rights are important, firstly, as a balancing factor, but secondly, as a base of what human beings need in a society, and that they could be justiciable. And South Africa was the first to have justiciable human rights. Then, of course, there was the issue, the land question. The land question, there was a question of how do you protect existing property rights, but whilst also creating a regime that will create a new order that covers restitution of land that was practically stolen, not won through conquest, stolen through the 1913 Land Act and the 1950 Group Areas Act, among others. So they had to work into something to deal with that, with the land, but in ways that were in the spirit of the post-amble of the interim constitution, which was we do not seek revenge, we seek restitution, and that we seek to heal the divisions of the past instead of exacerbating those. And therefore, the guidance that came from the post-amble of the interim constitution helped to work out this dichotomy of preserving existing rights that include ill-gotten gains, whilst building the basis for restitution and redistribution. So then the other controversial issue was the equality clause. We worked very hard to build in a substantive notion of equality. Unfortunately, again, as academics, we've been working on an understanding that formal equality, which is treating everyone identically, wouldn't work. And I was just looking at a 10-year review that I did in 1994 as part of a book by the Human Rights Commission, where I say formal equality is like having a fox and a stock, and you give both of them milk on a flat basin, and you say you now equal both the stock and the fox. And of course, the fox will drink its milk and the stock will have none. But
Prof,
that was
Prof,
a very okay.
Oh yes, my apologies, Prof. I wanted to just slip in this one as you were talking on the equality right, because as one of the co-architects and the drafters of these constitutional mandated laws, such as the Equality Act and the Employment Equity Act, how do you see these laws reinforcing those principles that you had in mind when you were drafting the Constitution?
Well, employment was a critical area of restitution. You will recall that job preservation starts in 1911 with the Mines and Works Act, which entrenched white supremacy and white privilege within workspaces. Then the 1926 Job Preservation Act and subsequent acts. But those acts were then repealed in the run-up to democracy. But as was indicated by Justice Moseneke in Minister of Finance versus Van Heerden, the removal of unjust laws did not remove the injustice. It just removed the laws. The consequence of those laws was accumulated economic and social power on the part of white South Africa. In other words, the pyramid society that was created by apartheid remains so, but no longer anchored in law, now anchored in economic and social domination. And therefore, when we negotiated the affirmative action provisions of the Employment Equity Act, in fact, I was part of that. I was part of two people, me and Professor Kathy Albertine, requested the Minister of Labour to name it the Employment Equity Act, which was to understand that we are dealing with substantive equality as opposed to formal equality. So those who now say the approach should be to treat everyone identically are wrong. But even those who say, no, we should treat everyone differently, or we should treat Black people differently by subjecting them to better education, are equally wrong. Because the problem does not necessarily lie in unequal education. White people constitute less than 10% of the population. So even if you had a bad education, there's enough Blacks that go to the same schools as white people. So education is not the reason we remain unequal. It is domination through economic control and social control that comes with economic domination. But also we haven't dealt with the neurological implications of what happened in the past. In teaching people how to dehumanize Black people, people were wired to not see Black people as equals, to not see Black people as competent, to not see Black people as honest. So as we, and women, and people with disabilities, etc., and as we now, by law, are required to see each other as equals, we still have a job to deal with the psychological and social remnants of the past laws. But just to be honest, we have to look at employment equity figures as they've been presented by the Employment Equity Act. Top management remains over 60% white, middle management, same, white, male, etc. Control of the JSE, there's been some inroads made, but only 2%, for example, of companies are entirely Black-owned. And therefore, the legacy of the past has been chipped away, and we thank those who have governed and those who have been governed for having allowed the chipping away of the legacy. But far too much of that legacy remains in employment, in income, in wealth disparities, and land ownership disparities, among others.
So, Prof, you've raised quite a number of challenges, and I would like to know, how do we then get to overcome those challenges? Because you know that we've had this constitution for over 28 years. So, what has been its role since its adoption, in shaping South Africa's democracy? What impact has it had? Because when some of the challenges that you are highlighting relate to just laws that are there, but which do not take away the injustices that are there. What are some of the key challenges that are facing the effective implementation of the Constitution and its related laws in South Africa today?
Right. Well, firstly, before we focus on the challenges, we should celebrate what has been achieved. Because inequality was manufactured in a very systematic way. As Stellenbosch professor Sampie Blanche explains, inequality in South Africa was not a random thing. There were sociologists that were involved, such as Fairwood, in structuring society to make sure that everything works together to keep Black people down. And of course, because of patriarchy, women were also kept down. Because of also misunderstanding of the nature of disability, people with disabilities were also kept down. People LGBTQI, etc., etc. Even if not kept down by law, some of them were kept down by social, psychological tendencies within our society. So what do we need to do go forward? Firstly, celebrate what we have achieved and learn lessons. For example, the simple thing that has been done in the last 30 years has been to simply extend the benefits that were only given to whites to everyone. And benefits such as electricity, and more Black people have more, who just generally is getting electricity. Well, mostly over 88% now. Water, housing, etc. There's also been an attempt to extend infrastructure to all rural areas, and these were deliberately impoverished starting the Glen Act in 1894. So firstly, it's just to extend at the moment, that would be a priority, to extend the things that historically white South Africa had to everyone. School infrastructure, library infrastructure, hospital infrastructure, etc. Then in addition to that, where we are lacking a little bit is restitutive action. So with land, for example, it's still at 74, I think about 72% in white hands. The RDP had a 30% goal, and by 2000, we didn't reach that. Then the goal was changed in the first housing policy white paper. It was changed to 20%. We still didn't reach that 20% by 2000. Then the National Development Plan recalibrated and said we would have land redistributed 30% Black by 2030. It looks like we might reach that, but that's still not enough, because you're still saying about 90% of your population should have ownership of only 30% of your land. So we would still have disparity, and that needs to be addressed. And then people say historically disadvantaged people don't need land because not everyone needs to farm. Land is not just for farming, it's for social purposes, but also it is leverage. When you're looking for a loan, they want collateral. And if you don't have land, you don't have collateral. For example, one of the mistakes that was made was that from 1999, a new policy was introduced. Instead of what Nelson Mandela had started, which was give people land to own, so that there's a level playing field between those who got land during apartheid and those who are getting land under the new order. Instead, government decided to own the land itself, to get land, then own it, and then give it to Black farmers at like 30-year loan. Now, who's going to invest very meaningfully when they only have this land for 30 years? But which bank, if a bank is competing between giving a loan to somebody who owns the land and somebody who has a 30-year loan, who's going to get the loan? So that was a mistake from government. We need to learn from those mistakes. But lastly, there has to be an agreement on constitutional governance and accountability. Because there are people, even as who are going into elections, who are saying no to affirmative action, who are saying we'll only deal with poverty. No, you can't cherry pick. You either are signing up to govern under the Constitution or you stay out. So everyone who goes into government should embrace this Constitution, and it has very 5 simple pillars. It seeks to establish a new society that is founded on democratic values, social justice, and fundamental human rights.
Prof,
everyone's life, every citizen's life is included, and every person's potential is. And the tie-up between all of those things is social justice, which is equal enjoyment of all rights and freedoms. And that's not possible at all without leveling the playing field. It's just mathematically impossible to play as equals when you've been members of a rigged monopoly game, when your team was kicked out and the other team was given all of your properties and even supported financially to work with those properties. You can't, without resetting the game, when you're being called back to play, be then said you're now equals. That's just irrational, apart from being unconstitutional.
Prof, I would not be doing justice to you before I let you go if I don't throw this one at you. You've said a lot about the rights which relate to Chapter 2 of the Constitution, but do you think that perhaps it's time that we amend that section that speaks on the Bill of Rights, which is Chapter 2, to include the right to electricity?
I think the sound distortion is making it difficult for me to hear you fully, but I heard a little bit about the governance part. I do want to add that.
Because I would like to hear your view on this one. I'm saying you've highlighted a number of, you've spoken a lot on the issue of rights, equality, and many other themes that are there in the Constitution. My parting question, Prof, is whether you think it is time that we amend Bill of Rights, Chapter 2 of the Constitution, to include a right to electricity.
Yeah. Having only picked up some of that, I would say going forward, having learned what we've learned, the other part will be to make sure that those who govern are always people who are picked on the basis of the right skill, and that Parliament ups its game in terms of holding the executive accountable, constitutional governance, in fulfilling all of the constitutional goals, but also making sure that there is no corruption, there's no ignoring the people, in other words, indifference to people suffering, and also that there is also no incompetence in the delivery of services. But having said all of that, as somebody who's worked in government, I take offense when somebody suggests that the majority of people in government are incompetent and the majority of people in government are corrupt. Because if it were so, the state of South Africa would have crumbled by now. We would not even have been able to bounce forward from COVID-19 if everything was falling apart and there's no competency. There are problems. These problems need to be tackled head on, but most of it is working, especially at national and provincial governments. But we really need to fold our, to roll up our sleeves and work with local government, even if it means trimming down cabinet and redeploying people to local government and employing them with the same salaries as cabinet, but provided that there's oversight and they monitored on a 6 monthly basis. And if they fail, they're out. No two ways.
Unfortunately, Prof, we've run out of time. Thank you so much for your time and contribution today, Prof. That was Professor Thuli Madonsela, one of the drafters of the South African Constitution and the former Public Protector of South Africa. Stay with us. On the other side, Shihla Mariso will be joined by Mr. Hassan Ibrahim.
It's fitting that final decisions in the Constitutional Committee was taken in this particular chamber, because this chamber reflects and displays more than any other chamber old style politics which we have departed from. I believe that was what motivated the prime negotiators in all the parties, but in particular Rolf Meyer and Cyril Ramaphosa. They in particular simply do not accept defeat in the sense that they always believed this was the case now, this was the case in other negotiating situations, that a solution can be found if the parties are willing to find a solution.
Always moved on the assumption that without the NP, it was unlikely that the Constitution would be adopted. Because if the NP didn't vote in favor of the Constitution, some of the other smaller parties would then, for political reasons, not want to allow a situation where the NP is seen to be the real opposition. And the chances were that all the other smaller opposition parties would then also vote against the Constitution. Together with Cyril Ramaphosa, the two of us served on a bilateral committee with the National Party, which we referred to as the Channel, which was a 2-by-2 from the National Party side. It was Rolf Meyer and Leon Wessels. The most difficult and intractable issues were then referred to that committee. We were hoping that we would have been able to crack the education issue that night too. I think we cracked the language issue on that particular evening, but we had failed. The National Party was particularly obstinate and I would say irrational when it came to the education clause. The main negotiator on this matter, Mr. Piet Maree, had simply thrown up his hands in the air and said, "Well, I can't negotiate this matter further." They were simply at a loss, completely paralyzed with this particular issue. The point had been reached where we had to say to ourselves that we are ready to go for a referendum, that if need be, we would hold a referendum. That was an important message to send to the other side, because if they thought that we would avoid a referendum at all costs, then it would have meant that we would have been forced into making unjustifiable compromises on what were very key transformation questions. It was very important for us that the Constitution had maximum support. That was important. It gives a special status to the Constitution. It says that it's not the document of some or other political party, that it's really a consensus document. It belongs to the South African nation and not the ANC.
The support the CA received from the Deputy President added to the impetus of our work. Deputy President F.W. de Klerk, whenever Leon Wessels and I met him, always spared a moment to encourage us. The insistence by Deputy President Mbeki the insistence by Deputy President Beki that we do everything to meet the deadline strengthened our resolve. I recall one evening when we had doubts as the management committee that we would meet the deadline, and I shared my doubts with him, just the two of us, and I said we might have to go to November. He gave me the most steely-eyed look I have ever seen from him. And he said, "Chief, that is not possible, that is not doable, that will not happen." As members of the Constitutional Committee, you argued, you differed, you fought, but I also saw you embracing. I saw you embracing at 3 o'clock in the morning when you reached an agreement on a matter which most of us thought we would never reach agreement on. I saw tears in your eyes, and I knew that you are the group of people who will deliver a constitution to this country. I thank you most sincerely.
Welcome back. You are still watching Parliament TV. Now, through the 1980s, the apartheid state was targeted by intensified mass resistance, strikes by organized labor, and crippling international sanctions, economic sanctions, that is. In 1989, negotiations began tentatively toward establishing a democratic South Africa. The framework for the new country's constitution was then, at the time, fiercely debated at the Convention for a rather democratic South Africa, known as CODESA, which opened in December of 1991 and drew together most of the country's significant political parties. The parties eventually agreed to negotiate an interim constitution, which would be followed by a permanent constitution approved by the people, still to be elected representatives at the time. The CODESA talks broke down in June of 1992. However, the impetus toward an interim constitution resumed in the multi-party negotiation process of 1993. Through this process, South Africa's interim constitution emerged around a bill of essential rights that no political body would be permitted to alter. The MPNP also provided for an independent constitutional court whose judiciary would ensure that the final future constitution also complied with the Bill of Rights. I am honored to be joined by Mr. Asim Ibrahim, the Executive Director of the Constitutional Assembly and advisor internationally on constitution making, transitions, and negotiations. He's also a lawyer, an author, a negotiator, an advisor, a political legislator, best known for serving as the national coordinator for the African National Congress Negotiation Commission between the year 1992 and 1994, and being the executive director of the Constitutional Assembly between 1994 and 1996. Mr. Ibrahim, good afternoon, and thank you for joining us here on Parliament TV. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
It's an interesting day where we commemorate the adoption of the Constitution. Can you provide insights into your role as the national coordinator for the African National Congress Negotiation Commission between those years, 1991 and 1994? What were some of the key challenges and milestones during this period?
Well, I think to put it in context, the period leading up to 1994 was a period during which we negotiated the interim constitution. But the interim constitution is also referred to sometimes as a peace treaty, because that's exactly what it was. It was a peace treaty, an agreement of peace between all the parties to ensure that the conflict of the past would be put behind us and we would then be able to resolve and proceed towards a democracy. And so it was critical that we needed to consider what the key milestones would have been to create conditions conducive for the negotiation of the peaceful negotiation of a constitution, removing violence, removing all obstacles in the way of negotiations, particularly when it came to political prisoners, laws that stood in the way of fair negotiation, and the ability to ensure that parties could collaborate and negotiate in a peaceful environment. So those were major challenges, but you must remember that those were also years in which there was significant violence. And part of that was to ensure that we brought about peace. And whatever we did had to bring about peace. So those were the major challenges and major milestones. But other than that, it was incredibly fascinating and heady days, very important because it was formative to the democracy we currently enjoy.
Well, like you just said, there were a lot of challenges, and one of them would be some of the political parties pulling out. How were you able to forge ahead even with such challenges?
Well, I think the important point was to ensure that the process itself was as inclusive as was possible. So we made every effort to ensure that all the parties that were involved in the South African landscape were engaged and were involved in the negotiation of the interim constitution and became part of the new constitutional dispensation in 1994. So inclusivity was a major part of it. Second part of it was engagement of the civil society and all the broader society elements in society, stakeholders had to be taken into account. So we made special effort to engage with all civil society, from unions to civic organizations to youth organizations, women organizations, and other civil society structures in the country.
Talking of meeting with those youth structures and civil society, what were some of the most significant decisions or compromises that had to be made during the constitutional negotiations, and how did they shape the final outcome of the constitution?
Well, I think most of the compromises would have been included in the document dealing with the 34 constitutional principles. Those constitutional principles guided the way in which the final constitution was drafted and contained all the key compromises, whether they be in negotiating the Bill of Rights or the structure of government, the structure of the state itself, and the fact that we now have 9 provinces when in fact we had 4 provinces before. So the structure of government, the nature of governance, accountability, all of those were part of the compromises that needed to be reached. I think it would perhaps be better if we looked at the decisions that were taken, because all the decisions that were taken were negotiated decisions. And in that negotiation, they contained various compromises in its own right. So the Constitution in its entirety is really a negotiated constitution rather than a constitution reflecting only one party.
In a clip that we just shared shortly, President Cyril Ramaphosa, when he was addressing the Constitutional Assembly at the time, he referred to people being emotional, having to embrace at 3 a.m. in the morning, for instance. Can you share with us any memorable moments from your time working on the Constitutional Assembly that highlight the complexities and dynamics of the negotiation process?
I think there were many highlights that came out in the process of the Constitutional Assembly. We're now looking at a period between 1994 and 1996. Essentially, some of the highlights would really be in the way in which the Constitution was drafted. So the process itself was a major milestone, but so would the substantive aspects of the Constitution. One of the key things I think it's important to explain is that the way in which the South African Constitution was negotiated and the content, the substance itself, changed constitutions forever throughout the world. Right from its architecture to the structure of the Constitution and the way in which the Constitution itself was negotiated, the process, all of which has changed the way in which constitutions are dealt with throughout the world. Having worked in constitution making in different parts of the world subsequent to ours, I can say to you without a doubt that the South African Constitution is a benchmark for constitutions that are being drafted everywhere else in the world. So a major milestone has been the way in which the process, and part of that process, or a significant part of the process, is the inclusivity. Fundamental to the Constitution, and a major aspect of it, was that the Constitution was a participatory Constitution. So it was done in participation with the broader community and stakeholders in society. And so it was a very, very inclusive process. But when you look at the substance of it, there are key elements that we cannot ignore. So for instance, in the past, constitutions were drafted mainly looking at he, she, if you look at the language. Our constitution adopted a gender-neutral approach to it and respected the gender sensitivities of people throughout society, and ensured that our constitution was drafted in a way in which all people felt included. So the substance as well as the process was overwhelmingly done in an inclusive manner and in a participatory manner, in a manner in which it attained broader legitimacy. So fundamental to the Constitution currently is its legitimacy. It's regarded as a legitimate constitution because it was dealt with in a participatory manner. It gained the respect and support of all of the people. But therein lies the major milestone, but also the challenges, because therein lies the challenges. It was a challenge to make sure that we brought all the voices and the differing voices into being in the new constitution. And that's what makes it such a fundamental document.
Well, it's a very interesting document. It's a world-renowned constitution. But there are voices, for instance, of young people who perhaps do not understand the full dynamics of what was happening at the time. Some criticize it as a document that served to further entrench the rights of those who owned land and the means of production. How would you speak to young people who are looking at this document, which represent their aspirations 30 years later? What would you say to them?
Well, there's something fundamental. What the Constitution did, which we should not ignore, is that it provided people with the right to vote. Everybody had the right to vote and to be equal in that. What it also did is that it allowed for the voices of people to come into and play a role in shaping the country, its laws, and its future. So fundamentally, what we did with the Constitution in 1996 was to ensure that everybody had the right to influence the future and the course of history. So for those people who feel that their views and their aspirations are not adequately taken into account, they have, for the first time, and this is what was done by this Constitution, it offers people that voice and that opportunity in which to actually make a change and make a difference. So where people feel that they have their aspirations with regard to land or economic rights or participation were not sufficient enough, what the Constitution does is that it provides that framework in which people do have that ability and an equal ability to shape the future. So constitutions are not intended to be perfect. No constitution is perfect. And ours cannot be a perfect constitution because time changes everything. And so requirements are changes continuously. And with those changes in requirements, constitutions also need to be amended and to be changed. And so if there are new issues that need to be reflected in the constitution, then by all means, the opportunity and the mechanism to do that, to effect those changes, are within the constitution itself. So you cannot complain about the constitution because it gives you the ability to actually change it. And that's what's so important about it.
Talking about changes, there were contestations even at the time. There were people who were resisting change and so on. In your opinion, what were the key factors that contributed to the successful adoption of the South African Constitution in 1996, considering the country's history of apartheid and the whole transition process to democracy?
Well, fundamentally, it captured in the slogan or the argument which said we need to find a win-win solution. So we did not find solutions that were purely based on a majoritarianism. So it wasn't the majority that counted, it was the voices of everybody. So the process itself was inclusive enough to ensure that even the voices of the minority were taken into account. So if you look at the way in which a constitution is crafted and opportunities of even minority parties to play a role in the shaping of laws, then you'll find that there are significant opportunities given to even minorities, which otherwise in most constitutions is not given. Precisely because our constitution is not a constitution of majoritarianism. It's a constitution that takes into account the views of the majority, but does not ignore the views of the minorities. And that's where the chemistry lies. And that is the chemistry that allowed us to provide the success that we currently find in our constitution.
Looking back, how do you assess the impact and legacy of the South African Constitution? Okay? Are you able to hear me now? Yes. I'm saying, looking back, how do you assess the impact and legacy of the South African Constitution on the country's democratic development and governance over the past 30 years?
Well, there are some phenomenal issues that I think we often, in the hurly-burly of debate and discussion, we tend to ignore. Let me take you through some of the key things which the Constitution did, which changed the political landscape forever and influenced the world as well. The first is that our Constitution gave us a right to vote. It gave everybody the right to vote and an equal right at that, which meant that people had an ability to actually influence the way in which the country was governed. Secondly, it provided, and you'll see that in the first clauses of the Constitution, it refers to human dignity. It recognizes, the Constitution affirms the inherent dignity of every individual, regardless of race, culture, or gender. Thirdly, fundamental to our Constitution, which changed the way in which other constitutions are considered now, is the principle of equality. Article or Section 9 provides for equality. It stands out as a bulwark against discrimination, ensuring that all South Africans are treated with equal respect and consideration. Then fundamentally, we tend to forget that prior to the current Constitution, our country was governed by a parliamentary supremacy, which meant the people in parliament had the right to change laws irrespective without any framework of the Constitution. What we did with this Constitution, we changed that to ensure that there was constitutional supremacy, which meant that laws, any laws that were passed, were not merely laws of the majority, but also laws that complied with the Constitution. And that was fundamental. The first point, which was that our Constitution ensured and entrenched a separation of powers. And that was fundamental, which meant that the legislature, judiciary, and the executive were clear, separate powers, and they could not infringe or impact on each other. The sixth, of course, is what everybody talks about, and where South Africa had changed the world is in its Bill of Rights. South Africa's Bill of Rights is still regarded as a model taken and considered throughout the world and respected as such. Fundamentally, what the Constitution also did is that it entrenched democratic values which never existed before. The Constitution promoted democratic ideals, participation, transparency, accountability, and it bound the state to respect, protect, and to fulfill the rights of South Africans, fostering a vibrant democracy. And what's fundamental about this is that it ensured that the democracy that we currently have is a participatory democracy, which means that no laws today can be passed without not just the people in Parliament adopting and approving it, but without the public also having their say in the way in the legislation itself. So our Constitution ensured that government could not merely draft laws at will, but had to do so in a way in which they managed the democracy in a participatory manner. Then the ninth, of course, is that our Constitution, if you consider it and what makes it such a valuable Constitution internationally, is that it provides for a development-oriented administration. So the entire administration is required to be development-oriented. And then fundamentally, and I could go on, but I would say I would stop at this point, which is the point of representativity. What our Constitution did is it ensured fundamental representativity of minority groups, minorities, people with disabilities, had gender sensitivity, and so all people and communities were included and could play a role in shaping the country and in government itself. So representativity was fundamental to our Constitution, which is some of the issues I think makes our Constitution stand out head and shoulders when you consider it against all the other constitutions of the world.
Well, speaking of representativity, we are going into elections in this month. And one of the rights that you've touched on is the right to vote that the Constitution has given us fundamentally. The IEC announces that there are 11 million young people who are eligible to vote, but only 5 million have registered to vote. What advice would you give to young people, particularly with regards to the right, like how we arrived at this right to vote as a country?
I think the youth in South Africa and internationally are beginning to awaken. We've seen them internationally. We've seen university students throughout the world rising up on international issues. We've seen our students rising up on a whole host of matters which they believe are of significance to the country itself. So I think the youth have played a role, will continue to play a role, and definitely have a role to play in participating. A number of the parties, in fact, all of the parties that I've looked at currently have a key feature of their electoral campaigns is to take into account the youth and the vote of the young people. I think the vote of the young people is a critical vote. Everybody is vying and competing for that. I think that's an important indicator of really the importance. I think what this election will prove is that young people will not stand by on the sidelines and be ignored, and they will play a significant role, because I believe the issues are of importance that are being debated and talked about with regard to the elections.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ibrahim. Let me thank you for sharing your insights and experiences with us here on Parliament TV. Thank you very much, and stay tuned. We will be bringing you more after the break.
Rolf Meyer, the leader of the National Party delegation in the negotiations. And I've been involved in the constitution-making process right from the start. on the interim constitution. I was directly involved in now throughout this process. So it's a question of 4 or 5 years that one has been directly involved in the process. The channel, again, was the strength of the process in that regard, if I may say so. Because we all knew that whenever it came to the push, the channel was there to sort of take over. Piet Maree for a long time warned me that education is going to be the most difficult issue to get agreement on because of the sensitivities. On the one side, our guys were forced to take a position that would carry along the support of the educationists from outside, particularly the Afrikaans community in that regard. At one stage, Cyril and myself were sitting out here on the steps of the lobby of this room, and I think we were saying to each other, now we have problems, because we could see there's a hesitancy to move forward. The lockout, we never agreed. We never reached consensus on lockout. What we did then was to say, okay, we find it unacceptable as it is, but let it go into the text. We will oppose it, but not to the extent that we will vote against the Constitution for that. But on the other two, property and education, we then continued even through the Tuesday to add a word here and to add a phrase there. And on both of those, I'm happy to say that I think we have reached satisfactory compromises. The Constitution, to my mind, was not only a settlement of this moment or for this moment. It really was a settlement that brought South Africa for the first time together, all South Africans. We could really say now we have one common law that unites us.
It was really an enormously important exercise that one was busy with, and I mean, you have to keep on reminding yourself very often just how important the decisions are that you're involved with. You know, it's not just an ordinary negotiations process. It really is something that's going to shape the country for the next century or two, you know, hopefully. Given the particular circumstances in our country, there was a lot of pressure from business that they wanted some recognition of a balance in the Constitution. And equally, there was a lot of pressure from the unions. I think the importance of a constitutional democracy really is to set up checks and balances, essentially, to say that if the government, for whatever good reasons, decide to behave badly, ordinary people have a way of stopping the government from doing what it wants to do.
Deputy Chairperson, this Constitution with its Bill of Rights is the mirror of South African society. It reflects both the history from which we have emerged and the values we now cherish: human dignity, equality, and freedom. It proclaims to the world that we are a society committed to democracy, we are committed to the rule of law and the protection of human rights. It proclaims to all South Africans that their basic needs and aspirations matter enough to be included in the country's constitution. The landless, the homeless, the women, workers, and the children of this country. It celebrates the richness of the diversity of cultures, religions, and beliefs of South Africans, and affirms that all belong as equal in our one nation. It commits the state to respect, to protect, to promote, to fulfill the rights in the Bill of Rights, acknowledging that it is not enough for government to simply refrain from violating people's rights. It is also necessary for government to take positive measures to ensure the full and equal enjoyment of human rights by all South Africans.
We, the people of South Africa, recognize the injustices of our past, honor those who suffered for justice and freedom in our land, respect those who have worked to build and develop our country, and believe that South Africa belongs to all who live in it, united in our diversity. We, therefore, through our freely elected representatives, adopt this Constitution as the supreme law of the Republic, so as to heal the divisions of the past and establish a society based on democratic values, social justice, and fundamental human rights. Lay the foundations for a democratic and open society in which government is based on the will of the people, and every citizen is equally protected by law. Improve the quality of life of all citizens and free the potential of each person. And instead of just recognizing only those who fought for justice, build a united and democratic South Africa able to take its rightful place as a sovereign state in the family of nations. May God protect our people. Nkosi sikeleli Africa. Morena buluka sichaba sayeso. God sien said Africa. God bless South Africa. Madzimu patucheza Afrika. Wosi katikisa Afrika. Although the preamble has its place at the beginning of the Constitution, it was in fact drafted right at the end of the Constitution-making process. The committee charged with writing the preamble formulated draft after draft. Ultimately, they reached a deadlock concerning the exclusion of the opening line of the preamble of the interim Constitution, namely, I quote, "in humble submission to Almighty God," close quote. It was only at 2:40 a.m. on Thursday, 18 April 1996, 19 days to the deadline for the finalization of the final Constitution, that a historic breakthrough was made on the issue. The final version was negotiated by Blaine Zimande from the African National Congress and Dr. Boy Geldenhuys from the National Party. This preamble can be considered the prologue to our future. Joining me now to speak about the significance of the Constitution and its impact on the lives of South Africans over the last 28 years is Mr. Obakeng van Dijk, who is a lecturer at the Nelson Mandela Law Specialist. My apologies, his research interests are in public law, specifically constitutional law, administrative law, and maritime law. He is currently busy with a Doctor of Law degree broadly investigating the intersection between administrative law and aspects of maritime law. Good afternoon, Mr. Van Dijk, and welcome to Parliament TV.
Good afternoon, Mr. Tendinkosi. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Mr. Van Dijk. What the role of the Constitution is and why is it significant to us as citizens of South Africa?
Mr. Tendinkosi, I'm struggling to hear you. There's something wrong with the sound. I don't know if the technicians can fix that so that we can hear each other. I don't know if you can hear me.
All right, let's try again because I hear you clearly on my side, but we can try again. Can you share what the role of the Constitution is and why is it significant to us as citizens?
Okay, I can hear you now. So the role of the Constitution, the Constitution that we have, is to, first, it's foundational in that it creates a country. It tells us what country we have. And it says in our section 1 that our country is built on these values. the value of constitutional supremacy, openness, the rule of law, and all those things. So the Constitution gives life to this country, and it tells us in there the kind of rights that we have. Where can the executive go? Where can Parliament go? What duties do they have, and things like that. So it's really like foundational. It's a structure of what a country should look like, and it says that everything that is not in line with it is unconstitutional or invalid. So it says, even though this is a structure, it has to be in accordance with this document, the Constitution.
And if you can briefly share some of your perspectives on the impact of the South African Constitution on the lives of ordinary South Africans since the adoption 28 years ago.
I know today we're commemorating the 28-year adoption of the final Constitution, but I think what started changing lives was what happened when the interim Constitution came into effect on 27 April 1994. So that's when the constitutional dispensation started, and there people had the right to vote. Everyone could have the right to vote, and there's been a trickle down of certain things that have gone and moved on to the final Constitution. And I think the Constitution, what has been really important is the fact that we have now socio-economic rights like right to access to housing, a right to access to healthcare, right to education. And not only those rights, we also have a right or the ability to enforce this right. So you can say, okay, we have this right to access to healthcare. If the state does not do what it said, the Constitution informs it to do, you have a right to take that state to court and say, the court, I have this right, and the state has failed to fulfill that. So I think having socio-economic rights is very nice, but the fact that we have a provision that allows us to go to court and say, we want to enforce this, right? I think that has been big. I think what has really been a major thing, again, with the Constitution is the rights of children. I think our Constitution has really given children rights. I think the society we come from has always viewed kids or children as less than, but the Constitution has really amplified that these are people, they have rights, they're entitled to this and this and this. And I think generally people had a problem with some of the rights that children have, but the Constitution has stood firm that these are the rights of the children. And for me, that has been really important. And another thing that the Constitution has been important on is the rights of LGBTQI people. In that Section 9 of the Constitution says you cannot discriminate on a person based on their sexual orientation. And you've seen that even the language of the Constitution, when you go through the Constitution, it doesn't say he or she can. It says anyone or everyone or every citizen. It doesn't, it's gender neutral. It doesn't say, okay, he, like most of our legislation, when you go through it, it says he or she, but the Constitution does not do that. And I think our labor laws has really been something that has stood out for me about our new Constitution, and how the dispute resolution mechanisms there have been really accessible to the general masses of our people. Anyone can, a gardener can just go to the CCMA and have their matter heard. And for me, that emanates from Section 23 of the Constitution. So the Constitution has really been great in giving us rights and, again, giving us the way or a way to enforce those rights. So those things would be the things that stand out for me. Yes.
You said a mouthful, Mr. Fante. Now, as someone who's an expert in law, what would be some of the key provisions or principles of the constitutions that have had the most significant impact on promoting equality, justice, and human rights in South Africa?
So Section 9 of the Constitution is a very comprehensive provision that deals with the right to equality. It tells us that everyone is equal before the law. And then it tells us, or it informs or forces the legislature or mandates the legislature to enact rights or to enact laws to ensure that we bridge the gap, because we are currently the most unequal country in the world. We bridge the gap to bridge the inequality between our people. So that for me has been really important. And from section 9.2 of the Constitution, we have things like BEE, affirmative action, and things like that. So it's been really important. I think section 9 has been really important, especially considering our history of apartheid, where people were excluded from participating in like everyday life and in like employment. So this section has been really important. And another section that you have to pair with section 9 of the Constitution is section 10 that deals with human dignity, saying that everyone has a right to human dignity. And like you see human dignity in every provision of the Constitution. It like you cannot have if you don't have the right to labor practices, fair labor practices, there's no dignity there. If you don't have a right to adequate housing, there's no dignity there. If you cannot go to school and get basic education or go to a tertiary institution and get tertiary education, where is the dignity in that? So the right to human dignity is seen in all the other provisions of the Constitution. But for me, I come from a community that has depended greatly on the government and the Constitution, and so I'll have to spend a bit of time on section 26 and section 27 of the Constitution. Section 26 gives us the right to have access to adequate housing, and it also tells the state to take legislative and other measures to ensure that that right is given effect to. Because some of us, or most South Africans, when the new constitutional dispensation started, they did not have the right to property that is protected by section 25. So now they are being told or they're being given this right by section 26 that the state must make sure that everyone has access to adequate housing, so that you can maybe exercise those section 25 rights. And for me, that has been really important in ensuring that people have adequate housing. We've had like the RDP programs and stuff like that. And section 27, that's also very important to us. The right to healthcare, food, water, and social security. And I think it was very important when the constitutional dispensation started to have these rights, but they're still very extremely important today because healthcare is still relevant to our people, because most of our people are unemployed. So they depend mostly on the state to ensure that the right to healthcare is given effect to, the right to have food, water, and social security. So that has been really a very important provision. The last one, I know you pressed for time, is section 38 of the Constitution that says you can enforce these rights through the courts.
Yeah, as we are there, because you're mentioning quite a number of rights, including section 26, which speaks on housing, healthcare, section 27. So in your own view, how has this constitutional democracy contributed in addressing the socio-economic challenges faced by the country, particularly in terms of poverty, inequality, and unemployment?
Thank you for that question. I think anyone who thinks or who would say, and it's election time now, we can say a lot of things about the state of the country, but things have improved in South Africa. Almost 80% of our people, or of South Africans, live in formal housing. Almost a similar number, probably 80% of our country have access to water and sanitation. And I think the last time it was around 17 million people who have access to social security benefits. And so the country has really gone a very long way in improving the lives of our country. So the Constitution has assisted us in ensuring that we get to do those things. Because I'm guessing if there was no right to housing, then probably we still have a lot more people living in deplorable conditions. So I think those provisions have really impacted positively on the lives of South Africans.
And in your experience, what does the Constitution play? What role does the Constitution play in ensuring accountability and transparency in government institutions and promoting good governance practices?
So the South African Constitution has introduced a very strong judiciary. We have a very strong judiciary, and the judiciary is where we go to cry and say, okay, the government is not doing the most to ensure that the rights in the Bill of Rights are given effect to. So that has been a really important. We have things like judicial review. You can take decisions of the government on judicial reviews to ensure that they are set aside. We also have constitutional Chapter 9 institutions, which have assisted a lot of people who don't have the means to go to court. Now they can just approach the public protector and say, this is what is happening. So it has assisted in their accountability. You can go to the South African Human Rights Commission. So Chapter 9 institutions and the courts have really assisted. Obviously, we would like a situation whereby we have dispute resolution mechanisms that are cheaper, speedier than the courts. And so, yeah, but for now, that should be it.
You have mentioned that the Constitution has enabled strong judiciary. Can you provide examples of landmark constitutional cases or decisions that have advanced the rights and freedoms of marginalized or vulnerable communities in South Africa?
A lot of people like to mention the fact that Mrs. Grootboom, the person who was the main applicant in the Grootboom case, died without getting the house that they had been fighting for. But what emanated from that was now the government knew what to do. So that was very landmark in ensuring that the lives of, now we have a standard that we have to adhere to. They might not have adhered to it then, but we have had a standard whereby, okay, Grootboom, so Grootboom would be a big case that have impacted on the lives of vulnerable and marginalized people. Another case that have done that is the TAC case, where the court was taken to, the government was taken to court to ensure that nevirapine, the drug nevirapine, was accessible in more places because they had firstly few spots where you can only access that, and so the TAC took the government to court to ensure that more people had access to that. That was really life-changing. What other case? I think Nkandla, even though it was executive, but I think the Nkandla matter told ordinary people that maybe we are actually equal before the law. If the courts can say to the president or the National Assembly, do 1, 2, 3, or you are supposed to follow this, it shows that maybe we are, as the Constitution said, equal before the law. There are more other cases, but probably pressed for time. But yes, don't want to dwell on this.
And as we commemorate the 28th anniversary of our Constitution, what are some of the key lessons learned and challenges faced in the ongoing process of constitutional implementation and interpretation?
What are the challenges faced on?
Challenges? Since we're commemorating this Constitution, so we have some of the key lessons learned and challenges faced in the ongoing process of constitutional policies and laws that affect our citizens.
I think one of the main lesson learned is public participation. I think it's not something that is really like highlighted, but public participation is something that we need to take as a lesson. I think cases like Doctors for Life really amplified the issue of public participation. So now we have that going forward, that we need to involve people in like legislative making. Another thing is that we need to utilize the Constitution and the bodies that are in the Constitution that are made provision for in bodies like the Human Rights Commission, the Public Protector, because they have shown to actually work for the people. And one of the challenges, obviously, has been funds. We don't have enough money in the country, and the biggest challenge is the usage of the money, the little money that we have. So corruption going forward has been quite a thing. It's a big, big point. But I see that the SIU has become very popular. So now people will engage in the activities of the SIU, and maybe the president will make more proclamations for more investigation. So, yeah, I think corruption is really the most challenging thing. Maladministration, people are not following the basic principles set out in Section 195 of the Constitution. And that, for us, it's what's killing us. The little money that we have, we are unable to use it effectively to ensure that the lives of South Africans change.
As we conclude our conversation, I would like you to respond to two questions. One, what are your hopes and aspirations for the future of constitutional democracy in South Africa, particularly in addressing the persistent socio-economic inequalities and promoting inclusive growth and development? And my last question, which I would also like you to respond briefly to it. Our Constitution has had 18 amendments. Do you perhaps think that it's time that we should be going on the 19th amendment to amend Chapter 2, Bill of Rights, to include a right to electricity?
Can I first take care of the first one and then my hopes and the last one? So the ESCOM case that was heard by the Constitutional Court in 2022, I think the tension between the judges there really made us think about whether we should, because they were struggling to find it in the Constitution, and so maybe we should have a right there that says everyone has a right to electricity. And I don't see why it should not be included. So I think going forward, we should have the 19th Amendment of the Constitution that makes provision outrightly to the right to electricity, because it's an important right. So yes, hopefully the 19th Amendment will deal with that. What are my hopes and dreams of the Constitution going forward? I think we forget that the Constitution can be amended. I think that's our big, big problem with this Constitution, that most people forget that it can be amended. So if what we have is not working for us to ensure that the socioeconomic rights are given effect to, or like the lives of our people are changed by what is contained in our Constitution, I think Section 74 makes provision for us to change that. So I hope that the office bearer and our representatives will always keep that in mind, that if it's not working, because we have 30 years, if we feel that, let's say, land reform has not worked, what can we do from the National Assembly point of view to change that, to ensure that going forward, all these problems that we've faced are addressed. So I think, yeah, we need to be we should have more amendments of the Constitution to ensure that it works. So if it doesn't work, let's change it.
Mr. Van Dijk, thank you very much for joining us here on Parliament TV. We'd like to wish you well on your PhD studies, and I would like to have a chat again with you in future. Thank you so much. Viewers at home, please stay with us. We'll be back after this.
The Constitution establishes a number of important institutions such as the Public Protector, the Human Rights Commission, the Commission for Gender Equality, and also the Commission for Culture, Language, and Religion. These bodies are charged with the vital task of ensuring that government remains committed to the values of this Constitution. This Deputy Chairperson, this Constitution is the subject of a rather fortunate paradox. It is no one's Constitution, and yet it is everyone's Constitution. Just as no one party sees in its constitutional proposals reproduced in their entirety in this bill, so too can no one person claim exclusive ownership of this Constitution. It belongs to everyone in the Constitutional Assembly, and it is a reflection of our collective will for a new, united and democratic nation.
Welcome back. You're still watching Parliament TV. We've just had a series of conversation, Tim Kosi, with our three specialists that we were interviewing. What stood out for you? We spoke to Professor Madonsela, one of the drafters of the Constitution. We spoke to Mr. Asim Ibrahim, who was the coordinator of the negotiations committee of the African National Congress during that transition period, and we just spoke now to Mr. Van Dijk. What stood out for you out of these conversations?
Well, the great thing about the two guests that I spoke to, which is in this instance Prof. Madonsela and Mr. Van Dijk, was the highlight of the Chapter 2, which speaks to the Bill of Rights, because we had them emphasizing on the issues of rights to equality, rights to human dignity. Prof. Obakeng going far as taking us to section 26, 27, which speaks on these rights, you know. So it was good to hear the importance of our constitutional provisions, and also the fact that Prof. Madonsela both actually highlighted that it is also important, as much as we look maybe at the challenges that we've been confronted with in relation to our Constitution, that we celebrate the achievements. I mean, having moved from the apartheid era into a democracy, something that was new to everyone, having sat in those negotiations and drafting, and sometimes reaching deadlocks because people were unable to remember that we came from complete different backgrounds. So they emphasized the importance of celebrating what we have managed to achieve as a country with our Constitution in the last 28 years. Amongst others was access to water. We have quite a number of people that have access to basic services, which would be aware that before 1994, actually, we know that the minority had access to those, but the majority of South Africans were deprived of those rights. You know, the right to healthcare, the right to housing. Spoke about the Construction and Development Program, the GIA that sought to. Those are the programs and policies of government that sought to bring back the dignity of those who were previously overlooked.
And it's been 30 years since, 28, 30 years later. You speak to young South Africans in the street, you talk to them about the importance and value of voting, which is one of the fundamental rights that came about because of the same Constitution. And I just look at you like, you tell them we didn't have electricity. They just look at you like, really? You think people lived without electricity for instance? That kind of things.
That us as media people should actually be preaching the message that South Africans who are eligible to vote should be going out on the 29th of May to vote, irrespective of who they vote for. Because what is important is the sacrifices that were made by the people that fought for us to have this opportunity to be able to vote. So it's important that everyone goes out, everyone eligible on the 29th of May, they go out to vote. That's the most important thing, because had we not achieved the milestone that we achieved in 1994, who knows where would our country be today?
Yeah, no, definitely. That's quite key indeed. And that concludes our special live broadcast commemorating the 28th anniversary of the adoption of the South African Constitution by the Constitutional Assembly on 8 May 1996. where we reflected this afternoon on the profound significance of this historic document, which is the Constitution. Enshrined as the supreme law of the land, the Constitution stands as a beacon of democracy, justice, and equality for all South Africans. And with that, we end the program. Goodbye.